death for everyone living within those borders. The same is true of the country of Haiti, which has only one thing to export, which is people, and which has been allowed at times to export these people when they are needed, and at other times forbidden to export them when they are surplus to requirements. Anyone who's read, for example, the Simpson-Mazzoli immigration bill, which is the nearest we have to an approximation of an immigration law in the United States, will notice that the main exemption for employing illegal immigrants is that any family, any American family, may, without breaking the law, employ up to 3 of them. That's the average size, perhaps, of a family consisting of maid, cook, and gardener. It's a coincidental and very amusing exemption. It is designed, in other words, to regulate the flow not just of labor, but even of illegal labor. It's quite carefully calibrated, and it will decide whether countries are producing citizens to order or not, and whether they're exporting them on time or not. And to me at any rate, impossibly offensive sight of the deportation of Haitian refugees who are leaving at the wrong time and in the wrong place and are coming because they fear for their lives and freedom and not because anyone has asked for their services as domestic labor, is as good a metaphor as you could currently have, not just of the relationship between one world and another, in this case the first and the third, separated by a strip of water narrow enough almost to swim. In other words, that's how near we are to being in Fukuyama's ideal family of all in the same boat. Can only be crossed by boats. And the relationship also between the elites in both countries, because it will always be true, not that there are first world countries that have money and capital and third world countries that do not, but that there will be, as there increasingly is in the United States, a large third world population living within the first world boundaries and within the frontiers of Haiti, a large first world elite which disposes of the national product as if it were its private property. And the relationship, therefore, will always be between the elites in both countries. And that in itself is enough, I think, to criticize the Fukuyaman theoretical underpinning of what we are complacent enough to call a new world order. There is a question as to whether or not it should be accurate to define Japan as a third world country, but as a candidate in the shaping of the new world order and as a rival to American power. It's obviously also a limiting case for the Fukuyama theory. Indeed, I've often thought that one of the reasons for Fukuyama's popularity is that it isn't very often that Americans are told they are number one by someone of Japanese ancestry. And there may be an element of narcissism in the reception of this thesis that it takes a vulgar journalist to point out. At all events, it is clear that a contradiction exists between something else that Fukuyama doesn't discuss, the war economy, and the development of new platforms of production in what used to be thought not colonial, because Japan was never a colony, but at any rate subordinate primary producing countries. The fact is that the United States did very well out of a war economy for a very long time, that its preeminence in this world order and its predecessor came very largely from the running of a war economy, that it was the war economy that pulled the United States out of the slump, that it was a war economy that carried it on a vast engine of productivity through the Second World War, and the war economy that allowed it to inherit the exhausted periphery of not just Germany and Japan, but also the United Kingdom and France in the 40s and 50s. But precisely because that was a monopoly, it allowed the countries such as Japan and Germany that weren't allowed to compete at war-making material to develop tactics of competition under that, what used to be called, in what I still think the stupidest oxymoron ever to become generally current, the nuclear umbrella. At any rate, the Japanese are regarded by the stewards of the New World Order as a third world country, which will be enough for my tour d'horizon. And you only have to read the California press to find out that Japanese Americans are considered by the stewards of the New World Order to be Third World, and also to notice that the violence and prejudice and discrimination that is increasingly being visited upon them is one that enjoys something like a semi-official patronage. That is to say that both state power and state rhetoric and the degraded rhetoric of democratic candidates like Paul Tsongas is designed to represent the Japanese as people who are engaging in unfair competition, something that in the ideal world of the free market and the capitalist economy is itself an oxymoron. There is, in the world of the free enterpriser, no such thing as unfair competition. No great fortune, no great empire, no great capitalist state would ever have arisen if this prohibition had ever been enforced. So we have the bizarre spectacle of a victorious America resorting to racial and national and cultural self-pity. And it isn't a fantastically pretty sight from whichever way you look at it. Third, and this is more an ideological criticism of Fukuyama than a material or economic one, we have the extraordinary example of one of the most important countries of the Third World, South Africa, attempting to make a passage from life as a semi-colony to a life as a modern state. And in doing so, naturally, inevitably, having to throw off the internal and external shackles of racial colonialism, which went by the vulgar name of apartheid, and which involved throwing off, as I say, not just the domination of a cheap labor foreign investment strategy, but also within the country of a system of divide and rule that was not merely, as was crudely represented, white on black, but represented the division and categorization of citizens as to whether they were Xhosa or whether they were Zulu or whether they were Indian or whether they were even, as a matter of fact, Japanese, or whether they were mixed race, and so forth. And in this colossal conflict, which comes to us as we read of it at about its middle point, it's nearly halfway through. In other words, the victory over it is in sight. What do we find? Instead of a non-ideological, value-free, end of history, liberal democratic, political pluralistic, admiring party system, what we find is that the transformation is being brought about by the African National Congress. The only political party, mass party left in the world that formally espouses the idea of the Socialist Popular Front, and which is before our eyes producing the greatest and most important and most dignified political revolution current. That must be, I think, more than a detail in the criticism of the Fukuyaman worldview. Everywhere else in the world, tribalism. Everywhere else in the world, racism, sectarianism, the erecting of new borders and the resurrecting of old ones, and the insistence by everybody, including many people on the American left, that all that counts is your own identity, that everything begins with oneself, the narcissism and solipsism of identity politics. And in South Africa, a giant movement of political revolution led by a party which refuses racial categorization from the beginning. Worth noting, probably, though, the greatest reproach to the complacency of the new definition of international order, and especially the definition of this as an American-led peace and an American-led orderly market, must be the question of Palestine. In the other examples I've mentioned, Japan, South Africa, even to some extent Haiti, though Haiti is very nearly part of the United States, South Korea, Brazil, Taiwan. So American power is